Welcome to the Slate Opinion Podcast. I'm Matthew Scalia, and I'm joined today by the Associate Professor of the Communications, Journalism, and Media, and the Director of the Ethnic Study Program here on campus, Dr. C. Dr. C, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for having me on your inaugural podcast.
So, I started this podcast to talk about a topic that seems to be looming over the horizon. It reminds me of the Y2K days. Everybody feels like there's this new technology coming that's going to destroy all of our jobs, put us all out of work. And that's artificial intelligence, AI, specifically generative AI. And you have an interest in this topic as well. You kind of taught about it before, and you integrate it into your lessons. So give us a little background on how you became interested in this subject.
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you mentioned Y2K and that the move into 21st century and the chaos that came with it. So my interest in technology obviously stems back to when I was much younger. I joined journalism back in the mid-1990s, 95, 96, and so I was pre-internet. And then when the internet, quote unquote, in its present form, or in the earlier form, though, internet was there in the 80s, 90s, but it came in its form with Google and Gmail. There was a lot of talk and a lot of confusion back then about what that would do. And I'm also happy you mentioned the word, there's a lot of confusion about that, whether generative AI is going to destroy. That was the fear as well. What it did then, in terms of in the internet and the World Wide Web, and what it will do and is doing in terms of Gen AI, is disrupt the flow of things. I don't believe it destroys anything. It disrupts, and disruption is not necessarily always a bad thing, but it can be. So my interest stems, again, like I said, as a journalist for 20 years. I was pre-internet, then I used the internet, of course, extensively. I remember many of my colleagues back then telling me the internet is going to kill journalism because people are going to stop going out and interviewing people and just Google everything. Secondly, they thought this was a passing fad and this would not last. Sure, a lot of platforms on the World Wide Web have been passing fads. Nobody talks about Vine or Flickr anymore, but there are new kings in their place. The internet is here to stay. So journalism did not die. In 1996, people had told me journalism is dying. It's still not dead. Mm-hmm. In fact, in many parts of the world, newspapers are still growing and growing rapidly as literacy grows. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. So journalism, its decline would be bad for society, not only for the cliche things, or not to say cliche, but the things we normally think of, like news and information and holding people to accountability. But a lot of early literacy was from journalism. There was I know there was a kind of a Hollywood biography that they did recently about how a gentleman read the newspaper to townsfolk who didn't know how to read, like early settlers. And kind of in a way, AI kind of takes away that thinking and that learning from us a little bit. And it kind of takes that steam out of journalism a little bit. And you say it's not going to go away, it's going to get disrupted, but only some are growing. Only some organizations are growing. A lot of them are really hurt by ad revenue losses from already.
So again, and I don't disagree with you too. Mm-hmm. So let's get that clear. Mm-hmm. But so ad revenues were going away from mainstream journalism for years. That is not AI's doing. For example, newspapers were bleeding ever since television became a big thing, mm-hmm. and then online information, free online news became a thing. People were loath to pay $4 for information they were getting for free till the paywalls came into picture. But still, they get a lot of information for free. And then social media is where information travels, whether it's correct or incorrect, it travels for free. So yes, ad revenues have been hurt. Newspapers are bleeding. Many traditional news organizations are suffering. And it's a multi-dimensional thing. So local newspapers are the most hurt because they don't have the funding backup of the New York Times, much like Harvard is hurt, but not as much as a local regional university would be by lack of funding. So similarly, generative AI is hurting funding for local newspapers to an extent that they are actually dying. A local journalism is actually at the risk of dying, and that is what is really hurting us.
Right.
But are we going to, we can either sit back and say it's going to kill us, or we can say, how can we adapt to this change like we did in the early 2000s, where journalism adapted to the World Wide Web and actually improved the quality of journalism. It is fashionable to say we don't trust the media anymore. Well, the mass media made terrible mistakes 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Yellow journalism, for example, is not a 21st century term. It is an 1890s term. Fake news is not new. In fact, as I tell my students often, in the early 2000s, when I wrote a story which was factually, let's say, incorrect, I would walk into office the next morning, my editor would call me to the side and say, what have you done? There's an angry person on the phone saying they're going to sue us. My job was to talk to that person, calm that person down and say, why don't you write a letter to the editor? And we'll print it with your comments and our correction. Problem solved.
Mm-hmm.
It did not spread. Today, if a journalist writes something in a credible, respectable news organization website or whatever, and that goes online, before that journalist has reached home, 100 people have commented, given counter arguments, provided facts and data to show how they were wrong. If you are a journalist who values your job, if it's an organization that values their credibility, they would want to ensure that doesn't happen too many times. So journalists have become a lot more careful, they have to become a lot more rigorous in their job to avoid being flagged every minute. At the same time, as we know, the internet, sure, it's full of a lot of incorrect and misleading information, but it does provide us with opportunities that we did not have back in the day. I can sit at 8 o'clock and get a lot of data that I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I can direct message somebody on Twitter. Similarly, with artificial intelligence, there are a lot of challenges, but it's a lemon. You have to make a lemonade with it. And you mentioned, it's hurting. It is, because people historically are resistant to change. That is human nature. We are used to a way of life. When that is disrupted, we feel threatened because we feel that our skills are going to be obsolete. And in some cases they are. But we must adapt. We must understand how the world is moving, and we can't change the winds, but we must adjust the sails.
What do you think that adjustment looks like in journalism? If AI will be harnessed by journalism, as the internet has, because great things happened in journalism because of the internet. It certainly didn't kill it like they thought it would. Right. You have video stories. You have stories like this that will go up onto the web. Mm-hmm. And that was all made possible by the internet. What do you think will be AI's contribution for good for journalism?
And that's $1 million question. I wish I could see into the crystal ball, but what I can tell you is what is happening now already. Mm-hmm. And yes, we tend to focus on the negatives, and I'm not saying we shouldn't. We should flag the negatives. We should flag people who use AI to generate content already. News organizations that were doing that, entirely producing chatbot generated content, are being flagged, have been flagged, are working to retract those things. However, let me give you an example. For example, a lot of a young reporter's job often is transcribing news releases. Yes. If you are not yet on the field, or you haven't got a great story for today, your boss will often tell you, I have done that, and then as an editor, I've made young reporters do that. Hone your skills by getting this 250-word news release into a 150-word copy that is fit to be uploaded or published or broadcast as a script on television or radio. Make sure you give the dateline, you give a good headline or whatever, or a suggested headline, all of that. That took away that reporter's or that journalist's hours' time. And then a copy editor spent 30, 35 minutes at least on those 3 news releases, getting a good headline, fixing small grammatical errors before doing other work.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I can give that template to generative AI because it already has the template of how to transcribe or translate or change a news release into my news organization's format for a news brief. It is fed into the system. That does it in 5 minutes flat. It'll do 3 news releases. It frees up my 45 minutes to go chase that investigative story where I needed that quote from that person who's proving to be elusive, or write that story in a more rigorous manner because my 7 o'clock deadline or my 8 o'clock deadline doesn't change. But now I have an extra hour to work on that story because this work, which is pretty template work, is being looked after by a generative AI. I need ideas for a feature story for the Sunday paper or for a podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling for what kind of topics I want to use for the podcast on any specific broad topic. I can do a focus group, invite 7 of my colleagues into a room and sit for an hour, not only time, but money on coffee and donuts to come up with those ideas and then scrap 6 of them and take one. Or I could ask ChatGPT 5 Pro, for example, here are my prompts. I need 10 ideas that are worth 20 to 30 minutes of podcast session, and we'll throw 10. And you say, I like this 5. Can you elaborate on these?
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back and give me 5 more? Each of these prompts are taking you 30 seconds and taking ChatGPT a couple of minutes to generate. In 30 minutes max, you have 10 ideas, which would have taken you a couple of days. Now work on them. Use the time you saved to actually do productive, constructive work that will make your journalism a lot better. You a lot more relaxed because you're not stressed out about the ideas that have not come. Right? So mentally, you're in a better place.
Mm-hmm.
You're rested. You can do a better job of the actual podcast because now you're thinking of the actual questions because you know the human being on the other side. ChatGPT does not. If you're using ChatGPT to say, give me 10 questions for Dr. C, you're not only being unethical, you're misusing or you're not using that generative AI as it should be. And that is where the danger lies. So as journalism faculty or professors or leaders who've done this before, our job is to teach future journalists how to use this technology for optimum efficiency, for ethical usage. This is just my personal opinion, but I think stopping people from using generative AI is the same as people who stopped people from using the internet in 1999, and people did. It might be hard to believe now, but people said, do not use the internet because that's going to spoil you.
It reminds me of, grade school. You can't rely on the calculator first. You have to learn how to do your math first. You can't just rely on the calculator to do everything for you,
Which makes perfect sense. You should not rely on the calculator to do everything for you. Mm-hmm. You must learn the art of calculating and then leave some calculations to the calculator so that you can analyze the data for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a software called SPSS, which churns out statistical data today. So I can analyze that data and say, so what does this mean for my research? Well, back in the day, people had to do that statistical analysis by hand, which took them a month. It takes me about 25 minutes. So I've saved a month's work of my research. Similarly, if you should learn the art of journalism, not for a moment am I saying, well, you know what, journalists don't need to write grammar anymore. They can go to Grammarly. They don't need to do ideation. They can just ask ChatGPT. No, you should be able to understand a good idea when you see one. And for that, you must know how to generate it. There is no replacement for the human brain. Because what is generative AI? It's artificial intelligence, large language models, which are trained by human beings. That human being is the brain that is generating knowledge for this brain, which is accumulating it and turning it back to you. You must be in a position to understand good when you see it, understand, rubbish when you see it as well. and then make sense of that information this is throwing out, whether it's Gamma, whether it's Gemini, whether it's ChatGPT, whatever it is that you're using, whether it's Copilot. There are a number of things, and I just mentioned 4. There is 10 for everything that you want to do. And that's just going to grow. From high school to college to journalism, in every place. I recommend e-textbooks to my students at the media literacy class.
They are very convenient.
And the publisher asked me, do I want to activate the Gen AI mode? And I said, what does that do? He said, well, when they take a quiz, they can ask Gen AI for possible correct answers. I said, no, I don't want that mode on because then they won't learn anyway. However, I can activate that mode post-submission so that they get elaborate details of where they went wrong and what is the correct way to approach it. You know what? That saves me 2 hours of explaining that to them so I can focus on things that will improve their knowledge in a constructive way. Then, how did I do on the quiz? What did I get wrong? Well, I can spend half an hour on that, but this is a better utilization of my time if Gen AI does that. And I spend more time on teaching them media literacy in different ways. That this is a way of teaching them too. So there are ways in which I can utilize AI.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're cautiously optimistic. You see this as a tool, much like the internet. And I say cautiously optimistic because we never know how things will develop.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned it's kind of a brainstorm. It's the assistant that never gets tired. And honestly, it's a little bit of a dream to be able to interact with your textbook if you're struggling to understand, what did that paragraph mean? What did that concept mean? I'm not getting it still. You can kind of talk back and forth with it.
Absolutely. And that's something, though we digress a little bit from journalism, but we're still on the idea of media and literacy because books are mass media. And so you're absolutely right. My generation learned differently. That does not mean that it was the only, or that is the only way to learn, or even that it is the correct way, if there is a correct way to learn. If there is technology that is available and that is going to help students to interact with another person or another bot beyond this person, that is great. Because a student may have a question at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or 1 o'clock at night. I am not there. If they can ask and get answers, that helps them interact with the subject more, that helps them get interested in reading more or watching a video or fooling around. Great. What is my intention? That you get engaged with the topic. My intention is not that you churn out into a memory book where you just kind of repeat what I told you a month back and I say, well done. You repeated every word I gave you in my notes.
Yeah, rote memorization versus a holistic learning.
Correct. That might learn for learning addition and subtraction, but definitely not for many other fields, including journalism. Where sure, your memory needs to be good. If you interview someone, you should come back an hour later and still be able to remember what that conversation was. That's how I learned my journalism. I didn't have a notebook or a recorder at some points because it was a sudden interview. I had a napkin and I just note down, whatever I could. But an hour later, I could remember 90% of what that person had said, including actual quotes. That is a training. And ChatGPT will not, or a generative AI will not replace that. If you forget to take notes and if you can't remember, you cannot ask, what did this person tell me an hour back? If they were not present, they would not be able to tell you. At least as of now, there is no replacement for core skills in journalism. Asking the right questions, understanding the answers and listening and asking follow-up questions, being able to write well, being able to think of great ideas. But if you have an assistant that takes the place of 10 of your colleagues in 1/10 the time, I think it would be not very intelligent not to use it.
Yeah, it does take care of a lot of the mundane stuff. My town, I learned that a road that I needed to use to get here was closed due to railroad tracks being repaired. The story was written by AI, part of the USA Today networks, Gannett's AI. They're kind of, they own a lot of the local newspapers. So it kind of takes that off the plate for somebody like me coming into the field to allow me to focus on, say, this project, if I wanted to work on it. I no longer have to transcribe it or anything. But how do we worry about the financial losses, or do you think that might be balanced out because maybe, unfortunately, a little less staff is needed in the industry? Do we think it'll still be a stable field that will grow because of this?
I mean, these are great questions. I can pay $1 million to whoever has the absolutely correct answer. No, I don't have $1 million. So earlier it asked me about journalism bleeding, and I'd mentioned how local journalism is in dire need of more funds, generative AI or not, and Gen AI is not to blame for that. That is the lack of support for local journalism. And I say that to my students, that when local journalism dies, communities stay in the darkness because you no longer know what you need to know, and those in power thrive on that because now you will not know that your community park is becoming a mall because the 60-day open period was not reported by anyone and you didn't have your time to go protest. That is the danger. But in terms of staffing being reduced, I don't necessarily think we will have less people and more robots in the workplace. Well, that's what they said for the internet. You know what? It replaced people, sure, with other people. People who adapted and could use that technology as their friend, as their assistant. The point here is as your assistant. If you use generative AI and become its assistant, it will take your job because it will realize that you're so dependent on it, you cannot work as an independent person, right? You need that to complete your sentence. Okay, I will do your job for you. But if you use it only on a need-to basis and make sure that it is your assistant and not the other way around, what will happen is, and that is my guess, is what I can say, is that journalists and journalism will adapt and start using, like always, newer technology. Hey, people thought at one point galley press was it, right? People thought at one point the offset presses were it. People thought different things at different points.
8-track players.
Correct.
They were going to be the future music.
At some point, somebody had asked, one of the other big computer giants, do you think Apple is going to ever produce a mobile phone? They said never. Prophetic comments, maybe, in that sense. But so we don't really know where it's going to go, but I think it is certainly going to take away certain jobs, certain kinds of jobs, but it's not going to kill journalism. Is it going to change how journalism looks? Yes. Journalism has changed over time. If you ask somebody who's been in journalism in the 80s, they would say journalism has changed and they can't recognize it. I started in the mid-90s. There's a lot of journalism I can't recognize in the way that they work. Big data. I was not a child of big data journalism because big data meant reading a lot of books, right? Or going to the library and getting all the data. Yes, it has changed. Has it improved journalism? I think so, right? It has saved time. It has saved energy. We have a lot more data. The Panama Papers couldn't have happened if I had to run around the world physically. So yes, journalism will change. It will take away a lot of traditional jobs, but it's not going to kill the profession. It has not died in the last 1,000 years. I do not think it's going to die because human beings will always have this innate curiosity for knowledge. Human beings will always resist those in power trying to throttle them. And over time, sometimes after a few months, sometimes after a few years, they'll get angry and ask questions of those in power. And the only way you will get information is from the fourth pillar of democracy, because the legislative, the judiciary, and the executives run things. But there's three pillars on a table will make it very wobbly. It'll fall. The world will always need the fourth pillar to keep it stable. And that fourth pillar is the conduit. They have access to those in power, and they have access to those who want to listen or hear or read, but don't have access to those in power. As long as that is there, even with social media, where you and I have direct access to the president of the country, We will still need that social media as a mass media to work as a conduit. Now, will journalism use those more than they are? They should, right? Should journalists use or news organizations use TikTok and the generative AI to create content there or help and kind of improve content? Yes, because that's how you're going to get 13, 14, 15-year-olds hooked to news, right? If you put it on Facebook, you're never going to get them.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to adapt to platforms and use technology that makes it even more attractive to our specific audiences. How has that changed? We are still talking about target audiences and messages that are tailored to specific audiences. We're just using different weapons in the armory to get the message across. I don't see anything wrong with that.
I agree. And so I agree with you. It's a bit of an optimistic tone. I think the end on it is that as long as the human spirit remains curious and it remains free, journalism will have a role in that in some way, shape, or form.
I just want to add that one word of warning, which I think is normal, that at the bottom, at the foundational level, of course, we have to remain ethical, mindful about the dangers of anything, whether it's technology or humans.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's not new. We should always be mindful of people trying to trick us
Mm-hmm.
or technology being used and abused by those who have unscrupulous ends in mind. Much like atomic energy, it can change positively the lives of millions of people by rechannelizing the course of a river, or it can kill millions of people if that same atomic energy is used to make a bomb. You know, you have generative AI, you can create brilliant stuff with it. The medical profession, for example, is going to help save many more lives
Mm-hmm.
with artificial intelligence. It already is. But in the hands of the wrong people, it can cause a lot of trouble with fake videos, etc., and so on. As long as we are mindful, as long as we are ethical in our work as journalists, I see generative AI being used for a lot of good.
More of a reflection of, it'll be more of a reflection of us than anything.
Absolutely. I think where society goes is always a reflection of the human beings who run or are part of that society. It's very easy to blame the technology, but it's humans who have created it and humans who are using it.
Yes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Matt.